President Biden delivered his first address to the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday. He stressed the importance of relentless diplomacy as the U.S. moves forward from its 20-year war in Afghanistan. The president said the world is now at a, quote, inflection point. He called on global leaders to move quickly on the pandemic, climate change, and human rights. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Keefe has more.
World leaders gathered at the United Nations for the first time since the pandemic amid heightened security. An F-16 even had to intercept a single-engine plane that violated restricted airspace. Inside, President Biden was on the defensive, addressing the strained relationship with China and the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, as even traditional U.S. allies voiced concern about American leadership. On China, the president said he's focused on competition, not conflict.
We are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocs.
He never mentioned China by name, but cast the rivalry as a clash of democracies and autocracies. The UN Secretary General urged the U.S. and China to patch up their relationship.
Our world has never been more threatened.
The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan rattled many European allies. The president today argued it was time to move on to fighting COVID and climate change.
I stand here today for the first time in 20 years with the United States not at war. We've turned the page. We're opening a new era of relentless diplomacy.
But his remarks came amid a new transatlantic rift with France. Today, the president met separately with the leaders of Australia and the United Kingdom, new partners in a nuclear-powered submarine pact that led Australia to drop a roughly $60 billion deal to build new subs with France. The French pulled their ambassador out of Washington and said Biden wasn't much different than former President Trump.
We thought it was a really serious, indeed, breach of trust.
And Ed O'Keefe joins me now from the White House. So, Ed, you mentioned how the president is trying to move on from the Afghanistan withdrawal and from wars. What is the president's vision for America on the world stage, and how was his speech to the UN received?
Well, essentially, the hope here is that the United States, through its foreign policy, can begin thinking much more about what he talks about, the Indo-Pacific region, or essentially China, and the influence that it has over that part of the world. This agreement that was signed last week between the UK, Australia, and the United States, obviously a big part of that, and it signaled to China how serious that these other powers are getting about its naval dominance in that part of the world. And as the president said today, no desire for another Cold War. The United States and China are merely in competition, not in conflict. And that also follows concerns expressed by world leaders, including the UN Secretary General, that these two countries need to work on their relationship or it could lead to a big crisis. So how exactly it'll be perceived, well, it's unclear, but the Chinese leader in his pre-recorded virtual remarks later in the day made clear he's not trying to bully, that China will not bully or invade any other country, and that it's trying to work in a multilateral way with the world through the United Nations and other organizations to deal on issues like climate change and the pandemic, which were also issues, of course, that the American president discussed today.
Well, you also mentioned President Biden met one-on-one with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. The pair will convene again later this week for a Quad summit with the leaders of Japan and India. Ed, why is the U.S. so focused on its relations in the Indo-Pacific region? I mean, you touched on it a moment ago, but I think for most Americans, they may not be paying quite as much attention to that part of the world, given everything that's happening domestically here.
Exactly, and the president's trying to tell Americans we have to, that this now is the greatest conflict, the greatest threat to American dominance, to democracies, plural, dominance and control of the world versus autocratic governments like that in China or places like Turkey. And so, you're going to see this president spend much more time than his immediate predecessors worrying about, thinking about, talking about China, and meeting with its neighbors who are also concerned about the dominance it's trying to demonstrate militarily through its economy and in other ways, to make clear to China that we're serious about checking its rise that has come at the expense of democratic freedoms, of competition not only in its country but around the world, and then, of course, with what it's trying to do with its Navy across the Indo-Pacific region. So this is a week designed to signal to the world we're done with that war in Afghanistan, we're moving on, and our top priority and concern is countering the rise of China.
Well, the president also met with UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson Tuesday afternoon. Tell us more about their discussion and also what happened at the end of an appearance before reporters where you were there in the room.
Never out of the ordinary to see an American president and a British prime minister get together when the British prime minister is on this side of the Atlantic. So it was part of that. These two don't know each other as well. Johnson was close to the former president, Donald Trump, doesn't know the current president that well, but this conversation was held in part to discuss, again, that agreement with Australia over nuclear-powered submarines, their shared concerns about China, climate change, fighting the pandemic. And for the Brits, they'd like to jumpstart the talks on a U.S.-UK trade deal in the wake of Brexit. There were questions asked at the invitation of the British Prime Minister by British reporters to the American president. What's the status of that U.S.-UK trade deal that Donald Trump had promised us? Why isn't it a top concern for yours? And then a question about that incident, remember from 2019 when the wife of an American diplomat killed a British teenager in a hit and run. There was a settlement announced today, but there's still some issues with it. The president asked about that by British reporters. There were no intended plans for these two leaders to take questions, but at the end of his remarks, Johnson said, well, why don't we take some? And he called on two British reporters who only asked questions, really, of the American president. When we tried to ask questions of our president in his office, his aides essentially shouted us out of the room. They've done that before. What was different and somewhat upsetting about this situation is to see an American president not take questions from American reporters after a world leader called on his press corps to ask questions of the American president. It's a little out of the ordinary, not what we signed up for, certainly, and, creates a bit of confusion and frustration for those of us who cover the president and are merely trying to get answers for the American public.
Right, and on that note, Ed, just for the record, what was the question you were trying to ask President Biden today?
About the situation down on the southern border and all those migrants, primarily from Haiti, crossing. Whether he had a response to that, and through shouted questions, through the shouts of his aides, it was very difficult to make it out. But after listening to the tapes, we've been able to hear just one part of what he said. Quote: "Violence is not justified." But we couldn't make out anything else he said because, A, he's wearing a mask, which is totally understandable and justified, but B, all the shouting in the room made it impossible to pick up what he was saying.
Yeah, a lot of folks very interested to hear his thoughts on that situation at the southern border. President Biden is also expected to hold a virtual COVID summit on Wednesday. Ed, what's on the agenda?
Talking more about what the U.S. is doing to help distribute vaccines across the world. And there's a bit of an arms race over this, no pun intended, with the Chinese, who announced today plans to distribute hundreds of millions more across the world to other countries. So there's kind of a race between the two competing powers over how much aid they can give to the rest of the world and show that they're concerned about this. Also expected to be a little more conversation about what's being done in this country and how it can be continued around the world. All of these meetings happening, as they say in diplomatic terms, on the sidelines of the United Nations, not officially part of the proceedings in New York, and it's being held virtually, again, because of the pandemic, because so many leaders who would normally come did not come. But he's trying to hold this meeting to demonstrate the U.S.'s resolve in trying to fight off the pandemic.
Ed O'Keefe, on a particularly busy day on your beat, Ed, we're always grateful to have you. Thank you.
Always great to be with you, Elaine. Take care.